Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, Battleship New Jersey is in dry dock number 3, operated by North Atlantic Ship Repair, and we're going to try and finally answer the question of why American fast battleships suffered from so many vibration issues. And to do this, we've imported an expert.
Hello. I don't know where the expert is, but they found me.
Yeah, what were you doing wandering around Philadelphia Airport?
I was trying to sneak in here, but I wasn't very successful because I got distracted by all the shinies in the reserve yard. Yeah, so, well, we're underneath the starboard inner prop, and as most of you know, the North Carolina class was very famous for having vibration issues, and most of those seem to have been traced back to a resonance issue. So the vibration built up at a certain point in their speed regimen. Unfortunately, initially that was the 25 to 27 knot speed regimen, which was their battle speed, which wasn't very useful. So after a lot of experimentation, including changing the numbers of blades on various props, they managed to not solve the problem, but relocate the problem to the 17 to 20 knot speed regimen, which was just above their cruising speed, but below the fleet speed and below the battle speed. So while it still occurred, it didn't occur very often because they were only ever transiting through that speed.
All right, so you brought up number of propeller blades. Can you tell us about what's important about 3, 4, 5-bladed propellers?
So the fewer propeller blades you have, the more efficient your propeller system is, but there's a limit to how much surface area you've got, and the amount of surface area dictates to a certain degree how much water you can push, and therefore how powerful your propeller blade is. So we're underneath a 5-bladed prop. So that's quite a powerful one, but it's relatively inefficient for a number of reasons, one of which is that the leading edge of the next blade overlaps the trailing edge of the previous blade. So as the water spins off and vortexes off this prop blade, it then interferes with the subsequent prop blade to a degree. Now that interference isn't enough to overcome the power advantages, but it is a less efficient way of doing things. So whilst some ships will have just all 3-bladed props or all 4-bladed props, if you've got a 3 or 4 screw large capital ship that's going to spend a lot of time cruising, but also needs maximum power when it really wants to get moving, one of the best ways of doing that is to have whichever sets of props you're going to use for cruising have fewer blades, and whichever sets of props you're going to engage when you're going to go really fast to have more blades. And that seems to be what they've done with New Jersey, because her outer props have 4 and her inner props have 5. There is a number of other advantages to that, one of which was, as they experimented with on North Carolina and Washington, if you have dissimilar numbers of props, then the vortexes that they create are dissimilar, which means that you have less issues with resonance.
It's interesting to me that they do a ton of tank testing with these ships, and they don't find these issues during tank testing.
The problem is with tank testing, some stuff translates almost directly. Some stuff translates at scale. So when they're doing, say, pitch and roll tests, on a small ship model, it doesn't have the inertia of a 45,000 ton ship. So if you have a 3-foot model of Iowa or New Jersey and you lean her over to 30 degrees and let go, as a model it's just going to go whoop, 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 which of course this ship's never going to do. But you can work out a proportional scale factor and then calculate down, or if you've got high-speed video, which they did even back then in the 30s to a certain degree, you just run the spool faster, you can then slow it down and then see what the actual behavior would be at scale. But there are some issues that just don't translate at all in scale model testing, and resonance happens to be one of them, because resonance depends on the properties of water, and the water's not going to change those properties whether it's a 3-foot model or a 900-foot battleship. But of course the distance involved and the amount of power involved and possibly even the frequencies involved are all going to change between a model and a real battleship, because a small model isn't going to have high pressure boilers driving turbines if it has any motors at all, and the actual dimensions are going to be different, which is going to throw everything out. So unfortunately, not everything can be tank tested, although most things can be, which is why these days, obviously, we also have computer modeling.
All right. So the Iowas don't quite have the same resonance issues as the North Carolinas. The Navy seemed to focus a lot of their work on the number of bearings in the inboard two shafts, the ones from the aft engine rooms. They've got the shortest propellers, so they had the least number of bearings is built. Some of the bearings, they took the actual bearings out of the coupling to give them more flexibility. Some of them, they added additional bearings. Was that ever going to solve the problem?
Not entirely. It would treat the problem, or more specifically probably treat the symptoms of the problem of differentially worn bearings, but ultimately there are a few different theories as to why the inboard shafts of the Iowas happens to have some degree of vibration issues. The one that I tend to find the most plausible has to do with the Holland Tunnel. Now, I don't know how far down we can actually see with the camera because it gets progressively darker, but what you'll notice, hopefully for those of you at home as well, is that much, much further forward, the ship's underside is completely flat. Now, of course, that means you're going to have a body of water traveling along under the ship as it goes along. But as we get to the point where the Holland Tunnel begins and the hull starts to rise, now you've got a greater depth. So if we had, I don't know, a 50-foot draft from the underside of the ship, by the time we get to here, it might be a 60-foot draft to the now where the underside of the stern is, even though obviously with the docking keels and everything, it's for the whole ship, it's still that same overall depth. And because it's confined, that means now if you essentially treat it as a column of water, the column of water that's entering at that end has a relatively narrow or relatively small surface area. So it's got, because the tunnel's the same width pretty much the whole way down, but a few feet in, it might only be a foot high. By the time it gets to here, the tunnel is taller than it is wide, so there's a huge surface area for this relatively confined column of water. So three sides obviously is steel, and on the underside you've got the rest of the ocean. And as we know from physics, what's called the Venturi effect, if you have a fluid, quite literally in this case water, but also works with air, moving through a confined, either square column, round column, whatever, some kind of confined volume, if you've got the speed, you've got the density, and you've got the surface area. So if the surface area that it's moving through increases, then the velocity also increases. And they actually exploit this effect for things like on an airliner, if you ditch and the ramps deploy, there's no onboard pump system that can inflate those ramps as fast as you see them inflate. So they have Venturi effect nozzles which exploit this expansion to accelerate the flow of air, and in that case rob some more air from the surrounding environment, which allows them to deploy that quickly. So it's possible that what we've got here is a Venturi effect occurring where this column of water, by the time it reaches the inner props, is going to be moving a little bit faster than the column of water that's outboard of the skegs, which is just part of the general ocean. And then that means obviously you can see where we've got the skeg here. If we've got a slightly faster moving column of water here, that's obviously now they're stationary, but let's say that's going to impact these two inner blades. The slower moving column of water is impacting the outer blades, and as the prop turns, obviously that's all going to change. But what it means is that from the perspective of the propeller shaft, you would have this side, the inboard side, being forced backwards with a little bit more force than this side, and so the whole prop is going to want to turn outboard slightly. Now, of course, you don't want that to happen because then you've got a bent prop shaft and open glands and everything, so that's then resisted. So the energy has to go somewhere, and that would be in the form of vibration because you'd have a very slightly off set of props.
So does the twin docking keel itself, the skeg here where there's no water running because there's ship, also impart that? The propeller is hitting water, then significantly less water because the ship's blocking it, then a lot of water, less water,
Yeah.
water.
It's possible in theory, but you can kind of see there's a potential that this might also be happening here, but you can also see that the skegs are sort of looped back. They've got a big crescent form above the prop, and then they cut back quite sharply down because it is a known problem. So if you have the skegs being quite wide and quite close to the props, then even if the water columns were exactly the same speed, they are going to have to reintegrate. That will cause turbulence, and if that turbulence is very close to the back of the props, then you'll get vibration. So one of the ways to address that is obviously to set the end of the skeg further back, and if you can't set it completely as far back as you'd like, then you cut it back, which is what they've done here. And obviously also the wider those skegs are, that's going to generate more turbulence, and that turbulence will detach and be further back, so which is pretty much the principle of a transom stern, although that's a benefit because there's no prop in the way at that point. And obviously here it narrows up quite a bit. Now, without precise modelling, it's difficult to say if that's a contributory factor at all in this case, although there is clear evidence they have accounted for the possibility, and so they've thinned down the end of the skegs and cut them back as far as they can. But one of the things while we were preparing for this that I did also notice that even if there's no Venturi effect, which there almost certainly is, and even if that's not the case, and even if everything is coming in completely uniform, and even if they've done all these cutbacks and everything else is great, the other thing is that the inside of the skeg is not quite, but almost completely flat. The outboard side of the skeg has a very complex curve because you've got the ship's hull coming in. So that's going to slightly affect the direction and speed of the water flow. And then the actual sort of line of the skeg comes in just here, which is just inboard of the prop shaft, which is set slightly out. So even if all other things were equal, the integration zone of the two columns of water is slightly off from the center line of the props. Now, whether that alone would be enough to cause a noticeable issue, again, it's difficult to say without precise calculations, but at the same time, we're talking about a ship that's at full load, well over 50,000 tons, moving through the water at very, very high speeds. That's a huge amount of water coming this way. Water's quite dense anyway, so even a relatively small imbalance could cause a reasonable amount of vibration once it starts hitting something solid that's not going to go anywhere, like the propellers. The other thing is, of course, that as each blade moves through the water, it creates a pressure wave ahead of it, the same way the ship's bow does. So if you've got a 5-bladed prop here, if you've got the water columns integrating whatever speeds they're going at, either above or below the line of the prop shaft, there's going to be a degree of turbulence in that space, and that's going to be further disrupted every time the pulse of a propeller blade coming past nearby goes through, which is going to cause even more complex disturbances. And with a 5-bladed prop, it's going to be vump, 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 vump.
Right.
So potentially that's also a factor. So it could be any one of those. It could be a combination of any number of those. I quite like the Venturi effect theory because it does seem to make sense with the structure of the ship. And we also obviously remember that not every US fast battleship class has the inboard 2 props on the skegs.
Right.
That varies depending on class. And obviously exactly how wide they are depends slightly on the class as well.
All right, so known vibration issue. Why does the US Navy use the twin docking keel system if this issue exists? What's the benefit?
Well, obviously partially you've got the fact, as we said, it's not something that can be completely modeled beforehand. So they're not going to, especially when they're designing the North Carolinas, they're not sitting down and going, well, we're going to accept this because they don't know that's going to happen. But there's a few advantages. I mean, obviously if you need to have multiple docking keels for, well, a keel and docking keels for a large ship because the hull's just too massive to be supported by one center line of blocks. And if you have multiple docking keels, you can set up multiple lines of blocks, which is easy to do beforehand, whereas if you see, say, some of the pre-dreadnoughts in dry dock, they've got lots of props coming off the sides of the dry dock, but obviously those have to be put in place once the ship is in there and constantly adjusted. This is better balanced and can all be prepped beforehand. One of the other benefits of skegs, whether they're inboard or outboard, is they lend a degree of structural strength to the stern. So one of the issues that's known with German ships, in part because they like their three prop system, is their sterns keep collapsing. even when they otherwise survive torpedo impact. A couple of ships in the Norwegian campaign get hit, sterns collapsed, Bismarck's wreck, sterns collapsed. It keeps happening. This provides essentially an open box girder, which offers a lot more support further back as the stern rises. So if the ship does take a hit in the stern, I mean, it's relatively unlikely this far back because there's so little stern in the water, but if anything did happen in the last, say, quarter of the ship, the skegs will provide a degree of rigidity to the ship, which makes it less likely the back is going to fall off, which is generally held to be a good thing.
How about maneuverability?
Maneuverability is an interesting one because in theory, much like the bilge keels dampen out the roll of the ship,
Right.
these massive great vertical fins sticking in the water should resist the turning of the ship. But potentially you could have a beneficial effect of the fact that obviously the skegs are in line with the rudders, which are just behind the camera, at which point if you've got a column of water or a sheet of water, however you want to describe it, coming along and essentially attached to the hull, again, we're using relatively crude terms because hydrodynamics is a very complicated thing, but getting columns of water to detach from the hull is a hugely complicated issue, which is, it causes drag, it causes all sorts of things. It's one of the major things that goes into stern design. But if you've managed to attach a column of water to a skeg and then it's projecting off, okay, it might interact disfavorably with the propeller blades, but it's also then projecting pretty much straight at the propellers, which is giving the propellers quite a lot to work with when it comes to the amount of force they can generate to rotate the ship. Then the question is that additional amount of force that they're able to generate to cause the ship to turn greater or less than the amount of resistance that the skegs are offering as the ship tries to turn? The fact that at that point, one is going to mask the other, so in theory the resistance is mostly going to come from one skeg, but you've got the turning benefits from twin rudders, may indicate that the ship is going to benefit more than not. And of course we have the fact that the rudders were set by default set slightly inboard, both inboard slightly to deal potentially with a column of water coming out of the Holland Tunnel. So they do seem to have thought about this quite a bit. The Iowas are in this rather weird circumstance, as I'm sure you know, of on paper their turning radius is quite large, but they are also very large ships, even for battleships, so proportional to their displacement and their speed, they're relatively maneuverable. But much in the same way that you might have a particularly agile SUV versus a not particularly agile saloon car, the saloon car might still, in some circumstances, be able to outturn you. But that's just, that's one of the hazards of having a really big, really powerful ship.
All right, final question. If you had to redesign an Iowa-class battleship to remove the vibration issues, what would you do?
I mean, yeah, that's
Make them
a difficult
slower?
one. Yeah. Well, you don't really want to sacrifice the speed. I mean, the part of the whole issue as to why the skegs are even here on any American fast battleship is to do with the overall hull form, and that hull form is dictated by the Panama Canal width, which is why they have the big slab sides, and that leads to a slightly non-optimal hydrodynamic form. That's why pretty much all capital ships, fast or not, have from overhead have a kind of a continuous curving elliptical hull form of some description. And the fact that you can't do that on a ship this size and fit through the Panama Canal both means you have the rather distinctive long narrow bow, although somewhat shorter on the South Dakotas, and the stern shape, and that in part dictates that you've got the skegs as well. So if you wanted to be absolutely ruthless about it to reduce the vibration, you'd want to either reduce or eliminate the need for the skegs, and that in turn would mean having a more traditional hull form, kind of like what they had on the Lexington class, which were also designed for very high speed, but on a ship that's supposed to carry 9 16-inch 50 caliber guns and armor to protect itself against those weapons and move at high speed, you'd end up with a beam which would be too much for the Panama Canal. Now, of course, we know with the Montanas, they said actually, stuff that will expand the Panama Canal to fit. And we also know with some of the wartime refits of the standards, they bulged them up to the point where they weren't able to get through the Panama Canal. So it's obviously not an absolute restriction for the US Navy. They were quite happy to restrict the standards, those standards to the Pacific or go the long way round. So at that point, it would be a case of, well, if you could go back in time and tell the US Navy, hey, you're going to have these issues, are you prepared to accept not being able to use the Panama Canal or having to pay for the lock expansions early? That will be the ideal way. If you're stuck with this particular hull form, it's a little bit difficult, I think, to work out, because obviously the North Carolinas were the worst, but although the Iowas have some vibration issues, they are much reduced, and the South Dakotas are kind of in between. So they were working on the problem.
Do you think?
Yeah, I would struggle to do that much better. I mean, maybe you could go back to the North Carolina outboard skeg. I think it's the North Carolinas have the outboard skegs?
South Dakota.
South Dakotas have the outboard. So you could maybe go to the outboard skegs, at which point, with the Holland Tunnel being much, much wider, then it's going to be less of a very narrow, confined body of water. But then at the same time, it also reduces the inline effects with the rudders, and it means your docking keels are much further out, which on a ship of this scale may not work out ideally. The problem is a lot of the things you could do hydrodynamically, like reducing the height of the skegs and fairing them up or fairing them out or something like that. All of that means you can no longer use them as docking keels, and the docking keels have to be somewhere. So it's just, if you're confined to this particular hull form, it's kind of a compromise. And let's face it, in the end, it's, if the major impact of your compromise is, well, we have to be a bit more on the ball with replacing bearings and so forth on the inboard prop shafts, and there's a little bit of vibration, in exchange for what is still, technically speaking, a treaty-limited battleship, just a pair of escalator clauses included, it's not all that bad a bargain.
So what would you do to correct vibration issues on Iowa-class battleships? Let us know in the comments section down below. Now that we have this new theory of what's causing it, what do you think could solve it? Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to donate to support the museum and our channel. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about the channel. Thanks for watching.